Welcome back to FCLE Seminar, your civics exam prep podcast. I'm your host, Mercedes Musto, and today's U.S. Constitution exam cram is on the Second Amendment, plus some of the landmark Supreme Court cases we covered in previous episodes. See, the FCLE tests your knowledge of the Constitution and its application, so buckle up, grab a cup of coffee, because this stuff can be controversial. The Second Amendment. The Second Amendment was ratified in 1791 and is part of the Bill of Rights. It reads, quote, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." End quote. The Second Amendment is about the right to keep and bear arms, a directive that has fueled a long-standing legal debate between two primary interpretations. Number one, individual rights, and number two, collective rights. Today, though, we are going to connect the Second Amendment back to two landmark Supreme Court cases that we highly suggest that you know for the FCLE. For refreshers on those landmark Supreme Court cases, check out our playlist on YouTube at FCLE Seminar. Case number one, the background. In the early 2000s, Washington, D.C. had some pretty strict gun laws. There was something called the District of Columbia Code, making it nearly impossible to register a handgun. And get this, all lawfully owned firearms had to be kept unloaded and or disassembled or bound by a trigger lock, even inside the home. Now enter into the picture Dick Anthony Heller, a D.C. special officer authorized to carry a handgun for work. Well, see, now he applied for a permit to keep a handgun at home for self-defense, and he was denied. That led to Heller suing the District of Columbia, arguing that these restrictions violated his Second Amendment rights. Like many landmark Supreme Court cases before this case was dismissed at the district court level. Then there was a reversal by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. They ruled that the Second Amendment does indeed protect the right to keep firearms in the home for self-defense, and that the D.C.'s code requiring guns to be non-functional went too far. Translation, this is a violation of the Second Amendment. Now, naturally, this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the justices had to answer the question, does D.C.'s code, the one called the Provisions of the District Columbia Code, does parts of that code violate the Second Amendment? The court's decision. The Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, ruled in favor of Heller that the whole ban on registering handguns and the whole keeping guns disassembled, non-functional, and trigger-locked, etc., violated the Second Amendment. Justice Scalia had a lot to say about this, and there was some major dissenting opinions. So check out the whole episode for more on that. For now, here are the key takeaways from the District of Columbia versus Heller. Number one, at the time of D.C. versus Heller, the Supreme Court established that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess a firearm for self-defense within a home. This was a major shift from prior interpretations that focused on the right existing within militias. Number two, the case involved a challenge to the provisions of the District of Columbia Code on restrictive gun laws that made it difficult to lawfully own and keep a functional firearm in a home. The court's decision effectively struck down these D.C. code restrictions. Number three, this was a 5-4 decision, and this decision was not unanimous. Dissenting justices discussed the militia-related intent of the Second Amendment and argued for a narrower interpretation that allowed for reasonable limitations, resulting in the proposal of, quote, interest balancing test, meaning that the government regulations must be sufficiently weighty to justify the proposed regulation, end quote. And number four, The District of Columbia versus Heller continues to be a highly debated and influential case shaping gun control laws and legal interpretations of the Second Amendment. Case number 2, McDonald versus the City of Chicago in 2010. The background on this? First, let's go back to 2008 with the District of Columbia versus Heller case. Now remember that case was about the handgun ban in Washington, D.C. that was indeed a violation of the Second Amendment. The catch? D.C. is under federal authority, so the ruling only applied to federal laws. Or did it? This left a big question mark. What about state gun laws? So now let's visualize the year 2010 in Chicago and Oak Park, Illinois, and get this. They also had strict gun bans in place. But after the Heller case, the people of Illinois filed lawsuits challenging these gun bans. What? Why? Yeah, the people argued that the Second Amendment should also apply to the states. This case got way complicated way fast and bounced around the courts before eventually making it to the Supreme Court. But here's the question the Supreme Court had to answer. Does the Second Amendment apply to the states through the 14th Amendment? More specifically, the 14th Amendment's Privileges and Immunity Clause, or maybe it applies through its Due Process Clause. Yeah, I know, right? The court's decision. The Supreme Court did make a decision, and it was a game changer. In a 5-4 ruling, the court affirmed that the 14th Amendment makes the Second Amendment applicable. What does that mean? It means that the right to keep and bear arms does indeed apply to the states. Oh, okay. See, we've got Justice Alito here writing for the majority opinion, and he leaned on the Heller decision, which recognized the right to self-defense as, quote, fundamental and deeply rooted, a right in this nation's history, tradition, and ordered liberty. And basically, Justice Alito, again, writing for the majority, was like, the Due Process Clause is the way to go. Now, naturally, not everyone agreed, so check out oyas.org for more on that or hit up our episode. In the meantime, the key takeaways from McDonald versus Chicago 2010 are, number 1, the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment, which protects an individual's right to bear arms, applies to state and local governments. This is called or known as incorporation through the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. Number 2, the court emphasized that fundamental rights, the ones that are deeply rooted in American history and tradition, since the Heller decision recognized the right to self-defense as fundamental, it applies to state and local governments. The McDonald decision significantly limits the ability of state and local governments to enact strict control laws, such as bans on handguns. This decision represents a significant shift in the balance of power between individuals and state governments regarding gun rights. These cases have a lasting influence on us as Americans. What are your thoughts on the Second Amendment? Hit us up in the comments for some civic discourse. Let's review. The Second Amendment was ratified in 1791 and is part of the Bill of Rights. It reads, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." The Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms. We connected it to 2 landmark Supreme Court cases that we highly suggest that you know for this test. Case number 1, the District of Columbia versus Heller 2008. This was about the case where the Supreme Court overturned a strict D.C. handgun ban, explicitly declaring that the Second Amendment establishes an individual's right for law-abiding citizens to possess firearms for lawful purposes, such as self-defense in the home. Case number 2, McDonald versus the City of Chicago 2010. This was the case where several people in Illinois filed lawsuits against Chicago and Oak Park for their strict gun bans. This action by the people was influenced by the Heller decision in 2008. This went all the way to the Supreme Court in a 5-4 ruling. The Supreme Court affirmed that the 14th Amendment makes the Second Amendment applicable and that the right to keep and bear arms does indeed apply to the states. We'll end with this. Justice Alito, writing for the majority opinion, leaned heavily on the Heller decision, which recognized the right to self-defense as, quote, fundamental to the nation's scheme of ordered liberty, or that are deeply rooted in this nation's history and tradition. That's all for this episode of FCLE Seminar. If you've got some serious thoughts on the Second Amendment, then man, hit us up in the comments. You can find us on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and stay curious. This is your host, Mercedes Musto, signing off.